So it's 2 minutes past, so let's get started. Right. Hello, my name is Andres. I am from Buenos Aires in Argentina, and I am a designer. And that's why I have this very sexy Argentinian accent. So I'm part of the user experience design team at Red Hat, and I'm also a core contributor to Patternfly. And during the next 40 minutes, I'm going to talk about styling a design system based on Bootstrap 4 and web components, which, in other words, it just means I'm going to talk about CSS modularity. So first, I'm going to give you a brief introduction of what design systems are and the importance of modularity and consistency. Then I'm going to talk about CSS specificity and the problems that it can bring to a large code base. Then we're going to explore two different solutions, either using web components and the shadowDOM, or just write really good CSS. And finally, we're going to bring all of that together in an open source Bootstrap-based real design system project and show some examples. And at the end, we're going to have a few minutes for questions and answers. But if you have a question during the presentation, just stop me at any time. So let's start with design systems. According to Mark Otto, the creator of Bootstrap, a design system is everything that makes a product. And that's everything, from typography, layouts, grids, and colors, to your voice and tone, style guides, and documentation. A design system is bringing all of these things together in a way that it allows your entire team to learn, build, and grow. And we do all of this mainly to keep consistency. And according to Jacob Nielsen, consistency is the most powerful usability principle. Because when things always behave the same, a user doesn't have to worry about what will happen. Instead, they will know what will happen based on earlier experiences. But let me run an experiment with you guys to try this concept of consistency. So what is 5 plus 8? Yeah, it's 13, right? You don't have to think about it. But what is 123 plus 34? Yeah, it is 157. So let's try that one more time. What is 123 plus 34? Yeah, it is 157. You don't have to think about it. And that's what we call cache memory. But for real, it's called human cognitive cache. And as long as you're experiencing something familiar, you don't require any effort to understand it. But if you are experiencing something genuinely new, you don't have anything on your cache to evaluate the data, and you have to evaluate it in full. But this human cache memory is becoming smaller every day. Because according to the National Center of Biotechnology Information, the average attention span of a human being has dropped from 12 seconds in the year 2000 to 8 seconds in 2015. And that's 1 second less than the attention span of a goldfish. And that's right. A goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds, which is 1 second more than any of us. And for example, at Red Hat, we keep consistency by following Patternfly recommendations. Patternfly is our ring to rule them all. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about Patternfly later on. So the only way to scale and maintain a design system while keeping this super important consistency is to make it modular. And think about a design system as a set of UI building blocks, like Lego blocks. Each one of these blocks goes through a process of design research, interaction design, then visual design, and finally, a crafted implementation. So when it arrives to your users' hands, they will have tested and beautiful UI components to build their applications. And a modular design system equals to happier users and, of course, better consistency. But while modularity sounds amazing as a concept, it is really tricky to implement. Mainly because CSS isn't the most friendly of languages. It's globally operating, very leaky, it is dependent on location, hard to encapsulate, and it's based on inheritance. But none of this comes even close to the horrors of CSS specificity. So by show of hands, how many of you know what CSS specificity is and how it works? Right. So CSS specificity is how the browser decides which CSS declaration to apply to an element. So every CSS rule has a particular weight, meaning that it can be less or more important than other rules or equally important. So as a rule, one selector can be more specific than, if one selector is more specific than other, it overrides it. And if two selectors share the same weight, source, and specificity, they will, the later on that appears in the code will be applied. And there is a way to calculate the weight of a selector. For example, a type selector, that's, for example, a paragraph or an H1, weighs 1. A class selector, for example, this class success here, weighs 10. An ID selector, for example, the ID header, weighs 100. And inline selectors, for example, a paragraph with a color of red, weighs 1,000. So this selector here weighs 11, 1 for the paragraph, and then 10 for the class success. And of course, we have the silver bullet, which is the important flag. So once a declaration is flagged as important, it overrides and outweighs anything else. So I don't know if you guys have used important before. I have done it, and I shouldn't have done it, but yeah, that's something that you can use. So basically, this is what CSS specificity is. And is it confusing? Well, it should be, because what's more confusing than an Argentinian designer talking about CSS specificity? So let me show you some code so you can have an idea of how this works exactly. So here I have an H1, which is inside a div. And this, can you see the code back in the back? Yeah? Right. So it has a class of cat and then an ID of elephant. So let me first add a background to it, which is pink. So the header is going to be pink, right? So what if I uncomment line 5? Is it going to be red, or is it going to be pink? Well, it is going to be red, because since they both share the same specificity, then the later one gets applied. Now, let's try with the first line, the class cat. If I uncomment that, is it going to be orange, or is it going to be red? Yeah, it is going to be orange, because a class weighs 10, and then it's outweighting the H1, even though it comes later on the code. So what about if I uncomment line 7? Is it going to be gray or orange? Is an elephant heavier than a cat? Well, in this case, yeah, it is, because it's an ID and it weighs more. So let's try with the last one, a div with an H1 and then a class of cat. Is this going to be yellow, or is this going to remain being gray? Well, yeah, it is gray, because this selector weighs 12. 2 for the cat, 10 for the cat, and then 1 for the H1 and the div. So if I comment back line 7, it's going to be yellow. And of course, as I mentioned before, if I add a style here, with background, let's say blue, then it's going to turn blue. There you go. And as I mentioned before, we have the important flag that it will outweigh the inline class, even though it doesn't weigh that much. So as a rule, class selectors will kill type selectors, IDs will kill classes, inline selectors will kill IDs, and then the important murders everything else. And if that wasn't clear for you guys, you should check out Andy Clark's CSS specificity word charts that explains everything with stormtroopers, Darth Vaders, and emperors, and it's a great way to understand it. So specificity is really hard to work with, but fear not, because there are ways to work with specificity, and I'm going to show you 2 of them today. The first one is using web components and the shadowDOM, and the second one is just writing really good CSS. So let's start with web components. Together with custom elements, HTML imports and HTML templates and the shadowDOM, they form the 4 standards that make up web components. So web components, in a nutshell, they allow us to bundle markup into custom HTML elements. So what's really amazing about these new elements is that they fully encapsulate all our HTML and CSS. This means that the styles you write will be displayed as you intended, and the JavaScript behaviors will be native to the browser. But the shadowDOM is by far the coolest one of the 4 of them because it's called shadowDOM, and I love that name. It's a great name to have for specification. So we use it together with custom elements. So the custom element will create the HTML element, and then the shadowDOM will provide the HTML and CSS, the HTML structure and the CSS, so the style for the element. Now, you can use custom elements on their own, but if you combine them with the shadowDOM, you will get self-contained HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which creates modular bits of code. And at least for me as a designer, having modular bits of code is essential to build my applications. And every time I think about the shadowDOM, it reminds me of Dragon Ball, which is a cartoon I used to watch when I was younger. And they have these little capsules. So when you press a capsule, you will get something like a motorbike or a huge spaceship or whatever inside. And the shadowDOM to me is the same. It's like a little capsule of code, and you can get like a small drop menu or a huge navigation. And this means that since it's encapsulated, you can use common class names and common type selectors without having to worry about conflicts elsewhere else. And this also means that you are killing specificity in a way. But before I move on and show you the shadowDOM, let's address the elephant in the room, which is, of course, the browser support. So although we are not there yet with the shadowDOM, the future looks really promising because Edge is considering it, and Firefox is already developing it. But that doesn't mean that you cannot use the shadowDOM today, because webcomponents.org has polyfills that will make the shadowDOM display the styles in Firefox and Edge. Now, I've tested these polyfills, and they are leaky, meaning that the style encapsulation is not 100% there yet, that styles inside the shadowDOM will get applied outside the shadowDOM. But before you jump into any conclusion, let me show you exactly how it works so you can know what it brings to the table. So remember that the shadowDOM will provide the HTML and CSS structure and then to a custom element. So we first need to create a custom element and then attach a shadow root. So let me show you how that looks. So here I have on my HTML a custom element, which is my component. And then on the JavaScript, I am first defining the custom element, which is my component. And now I'm going to add my shadow root here. So in this case, my shadow root it creates another root. And I'm going to show you exactly what that means. Let me inspect this so you can see. I need more room here. Sorry. Yeah. So, and then this shadow root will create an H1 and a paragraph with the color red. So here in my component, I have another root, and I have my styles and my H1 and my paragraph completely isolated from the other root. So you create two DOMs in a way. You have your normal DOM, and then this is a separate parallel DOM, which is the shadow DOM. So if I want to introduce any markup inside, so for example, I write something here, it doesn't really get displayed because if I open this, that something is there, but it doesn't get displayed because nothing gets into the boundaries of the shadow DOM. It's a completely different DOM structure. And even if I want to style it, so for example, here I have like all my paragraphs are blue, and even if I want to add the flag of important, it doesn't change. It is still red there because the styles that are applied to the DOM root they are not applied into a shadow root. Now, in some cases, you do want to give the user the power to introduce markup into your component, right? It wouldn't be so useful if you wouldn't be able to do that. But before I show you how to do that, let me introduce you to some terminology of the shadowDOM so we can speak the same language. So the light DOM is the markup that the user wants to introduce into your shadowDOM. Now, the shadowDOM is a structure that you guys as authors will structure your component. Now, the shadowDOM allows light DOM inside the shadowDOM through things called slots. And the result tree of that is the compose DOM. Now, all the nodes that move from the light DOM into the shadowDOM, we call them distributed nodes. So slots essentially are just placeholders, are a way to say, render the user markup inside the shadowDOM. So it's like if you have a fortress, you're opening some windows to let the users inside. So these distributed nodes get to cross the boundaries of the shadowDOM through these slots. And these slots can be named, and they can have a placeholder. So let me show you how they work. So in the same example I had before, let's create a slot around this element here. And you will see that as soon as I create a slot, my text here will change to something because I have something inside, right? So if I remove this, the placeholder paragraph that is there is going to take place. It's going to take place instead of nothing that is inside the component. Now, if I write the paragraph, for example, here, you will see that the paragraph is, let's see if I can push this. Yeah. You see that the paragraph is blue because this paragraph is outside the DOM, right? So it's outside the root of the shadow root. So the shadow root is here, and this paragraph is still outside. So the light DOM is get rendered inside, but it's physically outside the DOM. So now we come to the place where we talk about styling the shadow DOM. So the main benefit by far that the shadowDOM brings to the table is Sculpt CSS, right? But before I talk about that, let me tell you a story. This is my son, Federico, and he's 8 months old. And that means that my life for the past 8 months has been the space of time between changing one diaper and the other. So this is him, then he's doing his thing, now shit happens, and then he kind of realized that shit did happen. So diapers are really, really, really important in my life. And the shadowDOM is basically a diaper, right? It keeps your code and your shit contained. So as a rule, the CSS selectors that are applied outside the page, they don't get applied inside the page. And selectors and styles that are inside the shadowDOM, they don't bleed out to your DOM element. But sometimes you do want to style the host element, which is the component itself, from within the shadowDOM. Or you want to style this light DOM that comes from the outside from within your component. And there are 3 ways to do it. The first one is with the host selector. And the host selector will target the component itself when it matches the selector. So for example, you want to interact with the user when they add an attribute. For example, the attribute of disable. You want your component to look disabled. So you will use the host selector. Now, the host context selector will allow you to target, again, the component itself whenever any of its ancestors have the selector. And this is very useful to style when you have themes. For example, you want to create your component to change when you have the dark theme on the body tag, and you want everything to go along. And finally, the slotted selector will target the light DOM elements that are slotted into your shadow DOM. So let me show you these 3 selectors and how they work. So I have an example here which is very similar than the example we had before. It has a class of dark theme on the body tag. Then it has a class of blue on the component itself and the attribute of disable. So first, I'm going to style from within the shadow DOM the host selector. So in this case, first I'm going to make it display block because custom elements by default, they are inline. So I'm going to add the background and then the padding, and you will see that the box itself will change. Now, if I want to interact with the user and I want it to change to blue, whenever the user adds a class of blue, then I can do it from within the element. So if I change here, for example, I remove the blue class, then it will be back to color tan. And of course, I can do the same with attributes. So the attribute disabled here will make the component look disabled. Now, the host context selector is, as I told you, great to create themes. So in this case, I have a class of dark theme in my body here, and I want all the page to look as the dark theme, but I cannot select the shadow DOM from outside. So in this case, we are reacting from the inside. So whenever the class dark theme is present with the host context selector, I will inverse the color and make it look black with white font. And finally, the slotted selector will select the light DOM. So in this case, I have some light DOM inside the paragraph. So I'm selecting every paragraph that is slotted from the outside, and I'm going to make it pink. I don't know if it looks pink. Maybe I can change it to yellow so it looks brighter. Cool. So these are the 3 ways you can interact with the outside and change the styles of the component itself. But what if you want to style your components from the outside? Now, there is a way to do it, and that's by giving the user the power to change your component. But as you know, with great power comes great responsibility. We all learned that from Spider-Man. So if you're going to open the doors for your users to change your component, you must be aware that they can probably change whatever they want. So only open the doors that you really, really want them to change. So you do that with CSS custom properties, which are variables and mixins, and they are native to the browser. So variables are supported almost everywhere except from Edge, and mixins are not supported almost everywhere, but I'm going to show you them anyway because they are completely awesome. So in the same example I had before, here, I have this selector here, which is every paragraph inside the shadow DOM or every paragraph that comes from outside the shadow DOM. I want them to have a background of the variable background color. And then it has a default of red. So in this case, it will look red, right? And then I'm going to apply a pink theme. And this apply here is applying a mixin. I don't know if you know the concept of variables and mixin from preprocessors. It works exactly the same. But since this is native to the browser, then you can change it with JavaScript. It's not preprocessed, so it is pretty interesting. Now, on my CSS from the outside, I can change the background color to be yellow. Or I can apply the mixin pink theme, which will change the border and the color. Now, let's bring all of these together in a real, or actually an example I built. Now, I work from my house, right? I never, ever go to the office. I actually go like 3 or 4 times a year. And every time I go, I use my badge. And to me, it's like Christmas because I open the door and it feels like magic. So I built this badge here, which is a shadowDOM custom element. And I can actually interact with it. So I can go here and add the attribute of contractor to make it a contractor badge. Or I can change it to employee and make it an employee badge. Now I can use slotted spaces inside my shadow DOM to add my information. So I'm adding my picture and my name. And with the host context selector, I can change this card by theming it with a class of patternfly here in the body. So this would be my, in a way, my patternfly badge, right? But this is not completely accurate. So I have a variable here that it will actually put my real thing, the real thing I do for Patternfly in a way. So the shadowDOM, in my opinion, is really, really interesting, and it's awesome to work with CSS and encapsulate CSS, which is one of the biggest challenges we are facing. And the very good thing is that it defeats all the CSS VLANs, including CSS specificity. And projects like Polymer and other projects that you can see in webcomponents.org are already proving that it's ready for mainstream. But of course, not without its side effects. The shadowDOM polyfills is leaky, meaning that style encapsulation is not 100% there yet for Firefox and Edge and other browsers. But of course, there is another way to write CSS and keep CSS sanity. And that's basically writing really good CSS. So there are 4 basic rules to keep your design system CSS tidy. Use a namespace to avoid conflicts, elbow cells. Use BEM classes and atomic to make your design system modular. Keep your selectors flat to avoid problems with specificity. And write really good documentation. So let's take a look at these ones. So to avoid conflicts, all classes related to your design system and your projects should have a global namespace. For example, at Patternfly, we prefix all our classes with PF and then hyphen. Now, to improve modularity, I recommend you follow the BEM methodology. BEM class names divide the user interface into independent blocks. So BEM stands for Block Element Modifier. A block is the primary block of your component, which, for example, is PF masthead in this case. An element is a child of this main component, in this case, PF masthead section, and is divided with 2 underscores. And then a modifier is a modifier of the styles of your component, such as, for example, PF masthead inverse, which has 2 hyphens to divide a modifier. Now, to avoid problems with specificity, you must keep all your selectors flat. It's just the only way to do it. So as a rule, whenever possible, if you're using a preprocessor, never nest selectors. If you're not using a preprocessor, don't combine selectors to reduce specificity on your selectors. Then always use classes and never use IDs and never use important. And the main takeaway here is that the lower you can keep specificity, the easier it will be for your users to customize your design systems or your projects. And combining BEM with a global namespace and shallow selectors will allow you to create more explicit and encapsulated class names. And finally, write really good documentation. Good development, of course, is document-driven development, and good CSS documentation is crucial to a correct implementation of your design system styles. And it should include at least all your class names, where you apply them, what is the outcome of that class, if they are required or not, and any general remark, and also, of course, accessibility remarks. So for example, this class here, PF masthead, it should be applied to a header or to a bit or to a div. It initiates the masthead, and it is required. Also, you should always use it with the grid, and the accessibility nodes, they are far larger than that, but you must use a role, you should add a skip link, area tags, etc. And putting these 4 rules together, you end up with better CSS and happier users. It keeps your code dry and modular, and it's easier to read and maintain. So we learned about design systems and the importance of modularity and consistency. Then we've seen the horrors of CSS specificity and 2 ways to work with it, which is writing really good CSS or using the shadowDOM. Now let's bring all of that together in a real project. So as I mentioned before, I am a core contributor to Patternfly. which is an open source design system with a thriving community of designers and developers. And as we were looking to the new version of Buttonfly, we got interested in web components. So we looked into each one of the 4 specs, and although we decided to go with custom elements after testing them and making sure they work, we decided not to use the shadowDOM, at least not for this version, because browser support is not there yet. Now, templates and imports are still way under discussion, so we are not using them. So we decided to write a really good CSS guideline and follow it by heart and use the atomic design principles to keep our components modular. Now, Buttonfly is based on Bootstrap. And think about Bootstrap as an extension, actually think about Buttonfly as an extension of Bootstrap for enterprise use cases. So we've added new components like data tables, charts, and new menus, and things that are really important for these use cases. And then we changed the way it looks with better typography, better spacing, better colors, and ways to put lots of information density in a screen. Now, we are currently working on Buttonfly 5, which is based on Bootstrap 4. And as you might know, Bootstrap 4 removes support for IE9 in its latest alpha, which is alpha 6. It was like 2 months ago or something like that. And they're using Flexbox for all their structures. So overall, they're using utility classes, which are super nice, and all their components are shallower and much, much nicer. So Bootstrap 4, at least in my opinion, it's awesome, and it makes me happy. So these are 2 dashboards from Buttonfly. One has a horizontal navigation, and the other one has a vertical navigation. But they both share a thing on the top that we call the masthead. And this masthead has a logo or the brand name on the left, and then utility links on the right. It's a navigation for example, user information, logout, support, help, and things like that. So let me show you how we build it and how we are using Bootstrap 4 to do that. So the new grid system for Bootstrap 4, as I mentioned before, it's still based on the 12-column layout, but it is super flexible because it's based on Flexbox. And also, Bootstrap 4 has these utility classes for Flex that they allow you to do any of the properties that Flex has with classes. So I have here the brand name and the navigation, right? So let me add some borders so you will see that that exists there. So first, I will create, as you did before, a container to my grid, right? This is the same class as Bootstrap 3. Now I will create a row, and this row will trigger the flex. So this is already looking as 2 columns, even though I don't have columns inside. Now I can create columns. And if you see now, I am creating columns without any number, right? So this means that the space is going to be divided in the amount of columns I have inside. So for example, I have 2 columns now, but if I create 2 more columns here, I will have the space divided into 4 columns. Now, I can use the 12-column grid system as before. So if I add here a 9, for example, and I add here a 3, it will be separated into 9 columns and then 3 columns, like I did before with Bootstrap 3. But this is much flexible than before. Now I can also use things like breakpoints for small devices or large devices, as I did before. But the really good thing about this one is the flexibility you have. Now, I can also use the class called auto, and that will stretch the container to the content of its container. It will not stretch it out all the way through the middle. And I can use the class justify content space between. So this is justify content between, which is actually doing justify content space between from Flexbox. And what it does is it creates the same space between each component. So it puts one in the beginning, one at the end, and then if I add another one, it will be just in the middle. So if I add another column here, it will appear in the exact middle of the page, and the spacing between them, it will be the same. Now, I can justify content to the start, and they will be at the start, or even I can put end, and then they will go to the end. But the very nice thing about this way of building the UI is that we are giving the user the possibility to change the structure without having to change any CSS, right? We are leveraging all that Bootstrap has to offer in this case. So on our example, and let me make this larger. Right. Well, let's try to do it like this. Sorry, I didn't thought it was going to be so small. Right, so in this example here, you will see that, again, I have the logo on the left and then the links on the right. So all the structure is done in the HTML. There is no structure on the CSS. The CSS is only here for makeup. It renders colors and font sizes and the lines and everything, but it doesn't have any structural thing. Everything is done by Bootstrap with the grid system and the utility classes. So, for example, if I increase the height here to be, let's say, something like 5 frames, you will see that this increase and everything is aligned in the middle, in the center, vertically, which is something really, really tricky to do with CSS. And all the links are completely clickable. So try to do that with floats and position, and like the old way to do grids, it's almost impossible. So in the same way, we are building all our components, trying to leverage as much as we can from Bootstrap and making them shallow and reusable and giving the user the most amount of power to change things as they can. So I hope that everything I show you today, whoops, where is the presentation here? I hope that everything I show you today is useful for your projects. And if you need to build an enterprise UI, I recommend you check out Patternfly because it's made specifically for those use cases. And Patternfly is a healthy community full of open and smart designers and developers. And I know that being able to contribute to an open source project is a privilege, but if you're interested in JavaScript design or CSS at all, I invite you to join the community. We are on Slack, on slack.patternfly.org, or you can check the website to know where the mailing list is, or the GitHub repo, or actually if you're interested in CSS at all, you can ping me on Twitter, which is something I really love to talk and discuss. So anything I can do to help you guys, I am there always. And I am really happy to be here today, and thank you very, very much for being here in the room.